closed my laptop, and just sat there for a second. Not because I was upset, not because I was confused. I sat there because I had just made a decision, quietly, clearly, the way you make a decision when you finally stopped arguing with yourself about it. My name is Faye. I'm 31 years old. And 6 months ago, I sold my software company for $4.2 million. Nobody in my family knows. Let me back up. I started Loopline, that's what I called it, out of my one-bedroom apartment in Austin when I was 26. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a story I told at parties. I was writing workflow automation tools for small healthcare practices, the kind of businesses that couldn't afford enterprise software but were drowning in manual scheduling and billing errors. I'd worked as an admin at a medical office for 3 years before that, so I understood the problem from the inside. My husband Dean was the one who told me to actually build it. We'd been married 2 years by then. He was working in logistics, long hours, not a lot of money. And when I came home one night complaining about the same broken process for the 4th time that week, he just looked at me and said, "You've been describing the solution every time you describe the problem. Why aren't you building it?" I didn't have an answer for that. So I built it. The first year was nothing. The second year, I had 11 clients. By year 4, I had a recurring revenue base that surprised even me, and I had 2 acquisition offers sitting in my inbox that I hadn't told anyone about. Not my mother, not my sister, not Dean's parents, not anyone except Dean and my attorney. Dean was the one who said to take the second offer. He'd read through the term sheet 3 times. He sat across from me at our kitchen table with a yellow legal pad full of notes, and he said, "This is the one, Faye. This is the number, Faye. This is the number." The number was $4.2 million. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in March. Dean drove me to the attorney's office and waited in the parking lot. When I came out, he was leaning against the car with 2 coffees, and he handed me one without saying anything. We just stood there in the parking lot drinking coffee in the cold. That was the best moment of the whole thing. We decided together, before any of it became real, before the wire hit the account, that we weren't going to tell anyone. Not yet, maybe not ever. Dean had grown up watching money change the way people treated each other, and I had too, in a different way. I'd watched my mother treat my aunt differently the moment my aunt's husband got a promotion. I'd watched my sister's entire relationship with me shift the month I started paying off my student loans faster than she was paying hers. Money is a mirror. That's what Dean said. It shows you who people already are. We decided to give it 30 days. Just sit with it. See what life looked like with the number in the bank and nobody knowing about it. 22 days in, my mother called. My mother lives 40 minutes from us, in the house I grew up in outside San Antonio. She has a particular way of calling. Always late afternoon, always a few minutes of warm-up conversation before she gets to the actual reason she called. This call was no different. She asked about the weather in Austin. She asked if Dean was still working the same route. She mentioned she'd seen my cousin at church. Then she said her roof was leaking. She'd known about it for 3 months, she said. She'd gotten 2 estimates. The cheaper one was $11,500. She was short, she said. She needed about $7,000 to make up the difference. She had some saved, she said, but not enough. I had $4.2 million in a high-yield savings account. I said I'd figure it out. I transferred $7,000 the next morning. 2 weeks later, my younger sister, I'll call her Bree, called me. She's 27. She's always been the louder version of me, the one with the bigger plans and the shorter follow-through. We've always been close in the way that sisters are close when they grow up in the same house and survive the same childhood, but we've never been without friction. She was planning her wedding. She and her fiancé had been together for 4 years. I liked him fine. He was steady, quiet, worked in insurance. The wedding was going to be in October, a venue outside of New Braunfels, about 200 guests. She wasn't calling to invite me. She was calling because she was $18,000 short on the deposit. I hate to ask, she said, which is what people say right before they ask. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't resentment. Not exactly. It was something more like a small, quiet recognition, a filing away. I said I'd help. I transferred $18,000 the following Friday. 2 weeks after that, my mother called again. This time, it wasn't about the house. My mother has a younger brother. I'll call him Uncle Pete. He'd been running a small landscaping business for years. The kind that stays small, not because of bad luck, but because of decisions. He'd made a lot of them. He needed $6,000 to cover payroll for the month, she said. Just a bridge. Just until a big contract came through. She said it like she was asking for herself, but she was asking for him. I sent the money. In the span of 6 weeks, I had given away $31,000 without a single person in my family asking how I was doing, how work was going, or whether I was in a position to give it. That's when Dean sat down with me and said, "I think it's time to run the test." He said it calmly. He wasn't angry. Dean is not an angry person. But he had been watching, and I had been talking, and he knew before I did what I needed to know. "Tell them you lost it," he said. I stared at him. "Not all of it. Tell them the acquisition fell through. Tell them the deal collapsed at the last minute. Tell them you're okay, but things are tight, and you might need a little time before you can be as available as you've been. I want to be clear about something. This was not a trap I set because I was malicious. I didn't want to catch anyone doing anything. I genuinely, and this is embarrassing to admit, hoped they would prove me wrong. I hoped my mother would say, 'Oh, sweetheart, that's awful. Are you okay?' I hoped Bree would say, 'Don't even worry about the wedding. We'll figure it out.' I hoped Uncle Pete would say, 'Listen, I'll pay you back double.' I called my mother on a Sunday night. I said the acquisition hadn't gone through. The buyer backed out. I said I was fine, that we'd figure it out, but that things were going to be tighter for a while. I said I just wanted her to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 'Well, I'm sure you'll land on your feet.' That was it. No follow-up questions. No, what happened? No, what do you need? She moved on to talking about a neighbor's dog that had been barking at night. We talked for 9 more minutes about the dog. I got off the phone and sat down on the kitchen floor, not because I was surprised. I sat down because there's a difference between suspecting something and having it confirmed, and the confirmation had a weight to it I hadn't prepared for. Bree called 4 days later, not to check on me. She called because the venue had moved up their final payment deadline and she needed to know if I could still help with the balance. I said, "Bree, I just told Mom the deal fell through. I'm not really in a position right now." The silence that followed was different from my mother's. My mother's silence had been smooth, practiced, the silence of someone who had already processed the information and moved on. Bree's silence had texture. I could feel her recalibrating. She said, "What do you mean the deal fell through? I thought you said it was basically done." "It was basically done," I said. "But basically done isn't done." "So what, you're broke?" I said. "I'm not broke. I'm just not in the position I was in 6 weeks ago," she said. "Okay, well, I kind of already counted on that money, Faye." I said I was sorry. I was not sorry. She hung up after about 4 minutes. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what happened to the company. She didn't ask how Dean was handling it. She asked about the $18,000, and then she left the conversation. The next 10 days were quiet. Too quiet. My mother didn't call. Bree didn't call. I texted my mother twice and got short replies both times, functional, polite, the kind of texts you send to someone you're managing rather than talking to. Then I heard from my cousin, who told me in that nervous, overly casual way people talk when they're carrying someone else's story, that my mother had told several people at church that I had made some bad business decisions and that it was such a shame. Such a shame. I had given her $7,000 for her roof 11 weeks earlier. I want to tell you about Dean for a second, because I think you need to understand who I was doing this with. Dean grew up in a family that didn't have a lot. He worked his way through community college, transferred to a state school, graduated without a party or a ceremony because his family couldn't afford to come down for it. He's never once asked me for anything. In 4 years of marriage, through 2 lean years when Loopline wasn't making money and we were living on his logistics salary and my savings, He never once made me feel like a burden or a failure. When the acquisition came through, his first reaction wasn't, "What are we going to buy?" It was, "What do we want our life to look like?" He is the person in this story who knew everything and said nothing to anyone and protected me the way that I didn't know I needed protecting. When I told him what my mother had said at church, he didn't say, "I told you so." He said, "Now you know." Those 3 words. That was all. 6 weeks after I told everyone the deal had collapsed, I called my mother and told her the truth. I told her the acquisition did go through. I told her it had closed in March. I told her the number. She was quiet for a long time, longer than the first silence. Then she said, "Why would you lie to me about something like that?" I said I hadn't lied. I'd made up a story to see what happened when people thought the money was gone. She said, "That's the same thing, Faye." I said, "Is it? Because when I called you 6 weeks ago and told you things were tight, you talked to me for 9 minutes about a dog, and then you told people at church I'd made bad decisions." Another silence. She said, "I was worried about you." I said, "Were you?" "Because worried looks different than what I saw." I don't say this to sound cold. I say it because it's true. And because I had sat with it long enough to say it without crying, without yelling, without needing her to respond the right way. I wasn't calling her to fight. I was calling her to close a door that I had finally seen for what it was. I called Bree next. That conversation was shorter and louder. She was angry. She used the word cruel. She said that what I'd done was manipulative and that I had tested her like she was a lab rat. I let her finish. Then I said, "Bree, you called me 4 days after I told you I might be in trouble. You didn't ask if I was okay. You asked about the $18,000. She said, "That's not fair." I said, "I'm not trying to be fair. I'm trying to be honest." She said, "So what? You're punishing me for asking about money?" I said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just not pretending I didn't see what I saw." She hung up. There are things I didn't expect. I didn't expect it to be so quiet afterward. I had braced myself for a storm, for a family group chat explosion, for my mother calling Dean, for Thanksgiving to become a minefield. Some of that happened. My mother did call Dean. He listened politely and said, "I support Faye." My aunt sent me a message that said she'd heard what happened and that she thought I should consider how my actions affect the family. I did not respond. What I didn't expect was the relief. It settled in over about 2 weeks. Not happiness exactly, more like the feeling of setting down something heavy you'd been carrying for so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. I stopped waiting for the calls that always had underneath them a favor, a shortfall, a bridge that never got paid back. I stopped calculating in the back of my mind what I might be asked for at the end of every conversation. I stopped measuring my own worth to the people who raised me against the amount in my bank account. I want to be careful here, because I know how this story can sound. It can sound like I'm saying my family is evil. I'm not saying that. My mother grew up without much. She raised 2 daughters mostly alone after my father left when I was 9. She did things that were hard, and she did them without asking for credit. I know that. I hold that. But I also know that love is not supposed to be conditional in the way that it was. I know that $7,000 for a roof should not have bought me 9 minutes about a neighbor's dog when I called in distress. I know that $18,000 for a wedding deposit should have earned me at least 1 phone call that started with, "Are you okay?" instead of, "I need to know about the balance." I'm not angry at my family. I was for a while. But anger is a phase. What came after it was something more useful. The thing about money, real money, the kind that changes your actual circumstances, is that it doesn't change people. It reveals them. I know that sounds like something you'd see on a coffee mug, but I mean it in the specific, practical way. The money didn't make my mother someone who moved on quickly. She was always someone who moved on quickly. The money just gave me a test I could run with controlled variables, and the results were clear. I am still in contact with my family. We are not close in the way that I used to hope we'd be. My mother and I talk maybe once every few weeks. The calls are shorter and more honest, which I think is an improvement. Bree and I are still working through it. She came to dinner at our house last month, and we sat in the backyard and talked for 2 hours, and she cried once, and I didn't, and we ended the night with a hug that felt real. I don't know what that relationship will look like in a year, but I'm not trying to force it into a shape it doesn't want to take. Dean and I are good. We're better than good. We bought a house in the hill country with a lot of windows and a porch that faces west, and most evenings we sit out there with coffee and watch the light change, and sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't, and it is the most uncomplicated version of happiness I have ever known. Loopline was acquired by a larger health tech company. I stayed on as a consultant for the first 8 months of the transition, and then I stepped away. I'm working on something new now. Smaller, slower, no pressure to scale. I'm doing it because I want to, not because I need to. That's a new feeling. If there is anything I would say to someone who recognizes themselves in this story, who has been the person whose financial status determines how much warmth they receive from the people who are supposed to love them unconditionally, it's this. The test doesn't create the dynamic. It only shows you the one that was already there. You didn't build this. You didn't earn it. And you are not obligated to keep funding a version of yourself that exists only so long as you're useful. When I closed my laptop that Tuesday afternoon and sat in the quiet of my kitchen, what I felt wasn't grief. It wasn't relief yet either. It was just clarity. Clear and still and a little cold, the way air feels after it rains. I finally knew what I was working with. And that, more than the money, more than the house with the western porch, more than any number on any term sheet, that knowledge was the thing that actually set me free. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand philosophical way, just in the quiet, practical way you think about things when the dust has settled and you're sitting on a porch watching the sun go down and you finally have enough distance to see the whole shape of something. What I did wasn't complicated. I removed the one variable that was distorting everything, and I watched what was left. That's it. That's the whole thing. And what was left told me more in 6 weeks than 15 years of closeness had. I think about the $7,000 I sent my mother for her roof. I don't regret sending it. I regret that I sent it without asking myself why I felt like I had to. There's a version of generosity that comes from love, and there's a version that comes from fear. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of being the one who said no. Fear of losing a warmth that was never really unconditional to begin with. I had been living in the second version for a long time and calling it the first. Dean saw it before I did. That's the thing about having someone in your corner who is entangled up in your history. They can see the pattern because they're not inside it. He didn't tell me what to think. He just handed me a way to find out for myself. That's what real partnership looks like. Not someone who agrees with everything you feel, but someone who helps you find out what's actually true. Bree called me cruel. I understand why she felt that. When someone tests you and you fail, the easiest response is to focus on the test instead of the result. But here's what I keep coming back to. If the test was unfair, then why did everyone behave exactly the way they did? I didn't tell anyone how to respond. I just told them I was struggling. The responses I got were their own. I didn't author those. I only read them. There's a kind of wisdom that you can't get from a book or a conversation or even from someone else's story. You only get it by living through something and staying honest with yourself about what you saw. That's the hard part. Not the circumstances, but the honesty. It's very easy to explain away behavior that hurts you. I'm good at that. I had years of practice. What I had to learn was how to stop explaining and start seeing. The resilience part, and I do think it takes resilience, isn't in running the test. It's in what you do with the results. It would have been easier to take the money back out of the account, go back to normal, never say anything, and keep being the person everyone called when they were short. That version of my life was available to me. I chose not to take it. What I chose instead was clarity. And clarity, I found, is not always comfortable, but it is always worth it. It is the only foundation for anything real relationships, real decisions, real peace. Everything built on something other than clarity has a shelf life. Sooner or later, it shows you what it actually is. Faye figured that out the hard way, but she figured it out. And that's the part that matters.